Follow the White Rabbit. In the video game industry, few titles dare to do just that and explore deeply personal or psychological themes. While modern gaming is often dominated by action-packed blockbusters or heavily monetized experiences, there are rare instances where creators push the boundaries of what a game can say about the human condition. One such example is American McGee's Alice series, taking the beloved children's story of Alice in Wonderland and transforming it into a dark, gothic exploration of trauma, loss, and psychological disorder. Unlike many mainstream games that simply use narratives as a backdrop for action, the Alice series weaves its thematic elements directly into its gameplay, art direction, and character development. The original American McGee's Alice in 2000 shocked audiences with its disturbing portrayal of Alice's journey through a twisted wonderland, a place warped by her trauma. Its sequel, Alice Madness Returns, in 2011, built upon these themes, offering a deeper dive into Alice's fractured psyche while refining the game mechanics that supported her original journey down the rabbit hole. Both games stood out not only for their visual and narrative boldness, but also for their refusal to compromise on presenting the difficult, often painful realities of mental illness and personal loss. The gaming industry, however, has shifted significantly since these titles were released. The cancelled third entry in the series, Alice Asylum, represents a creative loss and a critical statement on the current state of the AAA gaming industry. Despite its publicized early concepts and the passion of its creators, Alice Asylum was never made, a casualty of an industry increasingly reluctant to fund and support risk-taking, thematically rich projects. By the end of this video, you'll no doubt see that American McGee's Alice series bookends the AAA games industry as some of the first and last games to explore its themes with such honesty and beauty, and that this very integrity is what ultimately prevented Alice Asylum from being developed. American McGee's Alice takes place in a dark, twisted version of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, reimagined as a psychological horror story. The game begins after Alice's family perishes in a house fire, leaving her as the sole survivor. Traumatized and driven to the edge of madness, Alice is institutionalized in Rutledge Asylum, where she remains trapped in her guilt and grief. Within her mind, Wonderland, once a place of whimsy and absurdity, became a nightmarish reflection of her mental state. Decayed, chaotic, and violent. The White Rabbit summons Alice back to Wonderland to defeat the Queen of Hearts, but the journey is much more than a battle for Wonderland's survival. It's also a battle for Alice's own mental well-being, as the world around her mirrors her internal struggles with trauma and self-doubt. At the heart of the game lies a profound exploration of mental health. Unlike most video games at the time, Alice didn't shy away from portraying psychological disorders in a serious, unflinching manner. Alice's return to Wonderland is not a fantastical adventure, but a descent into the darkest recesses of her mind. The once familiar characters of Wonderland, like the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, and the Dormouse, are grotesque and twisted, symbolizing the corruption of Alice's innocence and the psychological toll her trauma has taken on her. The game also delves into themes of guilt and redemption. Alice blames herself for her family's death, and her path through Wonderland becomes a symbolic one, moving towards self-forgiveness. The game begins in the Village of the Doomed, a desolate and ruined area inhabited by twisted creatures. The state of the village reflects her fractured mind, with the inhabitants representing the remnants of her former innocence now just barely holding on. Then you have the Fortress of Doors, a bizarre and disorienting environment filled with floating doors and staircases. The disjointed architecture and surreal design symbolize her mind's descent into chaos, where nothing is stable or grounded in reality, much less having a visible ground at all. The doors, which open to reveal distorted visions or empty voids, reflect Alice's search for meaning and clarity within her own mind, as much as it represents her inability to access it. There's also the Pale Realm, a chessboard-like environment serving as the battleground in which the war between the red and white chess pieces took place. The chess motif reflects how she feels like a pawn in a much larger, more cruel game, where the rules are dictated by forces beyond her understanding or control. Her own mind, the asylum, and the tragedy of her family's death. The game's narrative is layered with metaphors about mental illness, using Wonderland as a mirror to Alice's damaged psyche, a stark contrast to the lightheartedness of Carroll's original work. The gameplay of American McGee's Alice blends third-person action with platforming, puzzle-solving, and combat. Players control Alice as she navigates through the dangerous and surreal environments of Wonderland, armed with unusual weapons like the Vorpal Blade and a deck of cards. There are combat mechanics, but they're not the game's focus. focal point. Instead, the emphasis is on exploration and the journey through Wonderland's ever-changing landscapes, each meticulously designed to reflect Alice's mental state. Tying the level design into the themes like this elevates what might otherwise be seen as nothing more than a competent platformer. The gameplay mechanics reinforce the game's themes by immersing players in a world where nothing feels concrete. The distorted environments, coupled with moments of psychological horror, helped create a pervasive sense of unease, aligning my experience with Alice's. This kind of blending of narrative and gameplay was uncommon in games at the time, making Alice a uniquely immersive experience. Upon release in 2000, American McGee's Alice garnered critical acclaim for its dark tone, narrative ambition, and stunning art direction. It was praised for its mature approach to storytelling, with many critics highlighting its daring exploration of themes like mental illness and trauma. However, the game also had somewhat dated mechanics, particularly the combat. While it was not a blockbuster hit in terms of sales, American McGee's Alice became a cult classic. Its legacy persisted due to its thematic depth, influencing later games that would also explore psychological and emotional themes in more detail. Titles such as Silent Hill 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2 would later delve into similar topics of mental health and identity, and it's hard to argue that Alice hadn't paved the way for them to succeed. Alice Madness Returns picks up after the events of the original game, once again plunging Alice into the nightmarish world of Wonderland. After her apparent victory over the Queen of Hearts in the first game, Alice is still not free from her emotional trauma. Released from the asylum and now living under the care of a psychiatrist in London, Alice struggles with hallucinations and fragmented memories of the fire that killed her family. As her mental health deteriorates further, Wonderland calls her back, but it's now even more twisted and unhinged than before. This time, Alice must uncover the truth about the fire while also confronting herself in the process. The plot of Madness Returns adds even more complexity to Alice's journey than the first game did, effortlessly blending reality and fantasy. The game constantly shifts between Alice's grim life in Victorian London and her disturbing trips into Wonderland, symbolizing the ongoing battle between her desire to find peace and her inability to escape her past. While the first game laid the groundwork for exploring Alice's trauma and mental illness, Madness Returns delves deeper into these themes, particularly in its portrayal of repression and guilt. The game makes it clear that Alice has not healed, despite the apparent resolution in the first installment. Instead, she has buried her trauma even deeper, and her inability to face the full reality of her family's death continues to warp her perception of both Wonderland and the real world. Expanding on the ideas from the first game, areas of Wonderland once again reflect different aspects of Alice's mental breakdown. The game's environments, from the blood-red industrial landscape of the Hatter's Domain to the eerie, doll-infested wasteland, are symbolic representations of Alice's emotional state, each becoming more disturbing as she draws closer and closer to uncovering the truth. One of the most important themes in Madness Returns is the danger of repression. Alice is not just fighting with her own mind, but also external forces such as that of Dr. Bumby. Presented as a well-respected psychiatrist, Dr. Bumby is tasked with helping Alice recover from the trauma of her family's tragic death. However, his true intentions are far more sinister, and his character serves as both a narrative driver and a symbol of Alice's deepest repressed trauma. Throughout the game, Dr. Bumby appears to be helping Alice by guiding her toward forgetting painful memories. He uses hypnosis and suggestion to bury Alice's trauma, encouraging her to erase memories of the fire and the grief that has consumed her. As Alice's sessions with Bumby progress, Wonderland, her mental sanctuary, becomes increasingly distorted, reflecting the psychological damage caused by suppressing her memories rather than confronting them. It's eventually revealed that Dr. Bumby is not merely a manipulative psychiatrist, but also the direct cause of Alice's trauma. He was responsible for the fire that killed her family. Bumby had abused Alice's sister, Lizzie, and set fire to their home to cover up his crime. He's since used his position as Alice's psychiatrist to suppress her memories of the incident, protecting himself from being exposed. Bumby is a predator who exploits vulnerable children under his care, erasing their traumatic memories to manipulate and control them with the horrifying intent of selling them off. Dr. Bumby's role in Alice's life is a perfect embodiment of the dangers of repression. By encouraging Alice to forget her pain rather than confront it, he represents the destructive consequences of denying one's trauma. His repeated insistence that forgetting will lead to peace stands in direct opposition to the game's overarching theme, that true healing comes from making peace with painful memories, not erasing them. The more Alice succumbs to his influence, the more Wonderland deteriorates, illustrating the destructive nature of repression on her psyche. In the game's climax, Alice fully remembers the truth about Bumby and the fire. This leads to a confrontation both in reality and in Wonderland, where Alice battles the symbolic representations of her trauma. In the real world, Alice faces Bumby directly at a train station, In Wonderland, the Infernal Train, a manifestation of Alice's repressed memories and guilt, symbolizes the unstoppable force of trauma when left unresolved. Ultimately, Alice confronts Bumby, pushing him into the path of an oncoming train, symbolizing her reclamation of control over her own mind and the destruction of the manipulative forces that have kept her trapped in guilt and confusion for all these years. Visually, Alice Madness Returns builds on the gothic aesthetic of its predecessor, but with even more elaborate and haunting designs. The game's art direction is one of its strongest elements, with each level of Wonderland rendered in a style that is both visually stunning and thematically resonant. The environments are rich with detail, merging Victorian design with dreamlike landscapes that constantly shift between beauty and horror. The character designs have also evolved, with familiar faces from the original game becoming even more disturbing. This artistic approach helps to reinforce the psychological depth of the story. The contrast between the dull, grim reality of Alice's life in London and the exaggerated Wonderland creates a fantastic visual and thematic contrast. And the evolution in both character and world design perfectly captures the sense of progressive decay emblematic of Alice's jump from the first title to Madness Returns. In terms of gameplay, Madness Returns improves upon the mechanics of the original while retaining the mix of platforming, combat, and exploration. The combat system is more refined this time around, offering players a wider variety of weapons and several quality-of-life changes that make using them a smoother experience, such as the updated targeting system. These changes are likely due in part to the sequel launching on the Xbox 360 and PS3, requiring changes to these mechanics as the vast majority of players would now be using controllers as their input method over keyboard and mouse. The game's platforming segments are more complex, with elaborate environments that require precise timing and careful navigation, both possible as the controls were tightened up from the original. One of the game's standout features is the ability to shrink Alice at will, allowing her to navigate hidden paths and secret areas. The shrinking mechanic, on top of already just putting a twist on the source material, adds a layer of symbolism. Psychologically, it makes sense that Alice would want to be small, to be able to hide away from everything. Additionally, players can uncover hidden memories scattered throughout the levels, acting as the game's collectibles. Upon its release, Alice Madness Returns was positively received, with critics praising its art direction, thematic ambition, and its continued exploration of Alice's psychological trauma. This praise was very well deserved. However, similar to the original, it could feel repetitive at times. Despite this, the game resonated with players who appreciated its willingness to tackle dark, mature themes in a way that was rare for AAA games, and still is to a certain degree. But the industry was rapidly shifting towards massive blockbuster experiences driven by action, multiplayer modes, and commercial success. Madness Returns stood out in this context as a game that prioritized artistic expression and narrative over more mainstream gameplay mechanics. This made it an outlier in an industry increasingly focused on profit margins, DLC, and games-as-a-service models. As one of the last big-budget games of its kind, Madness Returns represented a creative risk that many developers and publishers were no longer willing to take. The series' commitment to exploring deep personal themes while maintaining a unique artistic vision was at odds with the industry's growing reliance on formulaic game design. This tension between creativity and commercial viability would eventually play a crucial role in the cancellation of the third game, Alice Asylum. Alice Asylum was conceived as the third and final entry in American McGee's Alice series, intended to bring Alice's journey through trauma, madness, and self-discovery to a definitive conclusion. Following the success of Madness Returns, fans eagerly anticipated the continuation of Alice's story. However, despite early excitement and ongoing interest from the fanbase, Alice Asylum faced numerous developmental challenges that ultimately led to its cancellation. After the release of Madness Returns, American McGee began publicly discussing his ideas for a third game in the series, which he envisioned as the darkest and most emotionally intense entry yet. The game was meant to delve even deeper into Alice's mind, exploring the full extent of her unresolved trauma and how it shaped her identity. Despite McGee's passion for the project and the enthusiasm of the community, securing the necessary funding and publisher support proved to be a significant hurdle. Though Alice Asylum was never officially greenlit by any major publisher, American McGee shared numerous concept materials with the public, providing a glimpse into what the game might have looked like. The gameplay would have served as an evolution of the series. Players progress through 12 unique realms in a mostly linear fashion, while the Hall of Doors acts as a central hub that connects the different worlds and allows players to revisit areas, suggesting further emphasis on collectibles like those present in Madness Returns. Getting around these environments employed the use of a far expanded moveset from the previous games. Pirouettes, wall climbing, swimming, tightrope walking, and rope swinging on top of the normal running and double jump abilities. Alice even has stealth abilities for sneaking past enemies this time around. The core combat is still centered around the Vorpal Blade, but new enemy types would be introduced to further spice things up. There would be the Telltale, which signals their presence with sounds, Repair, where enemies can heal themselves if given enough time, and Shadow Step, a short-range teleport that forces players to constantly change up their tactics and keep an eye on everyone during a fight. There was to be a renewed focus on the puzzle elements as well, ranging from simple platforming and exploration ones to more mind-bending ones that require critical thinking from the player. One of my favorite would-be new mechanics is the dress system, allowing players to change Alice's outfit and employ the special abilities associated with each one. Some had more combat-focused abilities, while others would be required for solving certain puzzles, but the designs were stunning across the board. The story of Alice Asylum might have seemed redundant at first with the way things were left at the end of Madness Returns, but after reading it over in the design document, it more than justifies its own existence. The game would see Alice being taken through the different stages of grief, each represented by the environments in Wonderland. This not only gave each level more of its own visual identity, but tied the narrative throughline of the game directly into the level designs themselves. For example, there's the Carnival of Fools, a denial realm. Here, Alice faces a distorted carnival environment filled with colorful and eerie figures and events. This segment of the story revolves around Alice's refusal to accept her family's death, resulting in her battling twisted versions of circus performers and attending an upside-down carnival. Here, she eventually confronts the Tweedle brothers, who are embodiments of deception and denial. Then there's an anger realm, the Queen's Domain. Here we see Alice traversing the forest on the way to the castle, making her way through a hedge maze and fighting card guards along the way. When she reaches a courthouse and is found guilty by the chess pieces there, she gains her rage form, leading to a boss fight with the judge. From there, Alice makes her way through a dungeon where she encounters the Child of Fire, mirroring her fear of fire that resulted from the death of her family. It's here that Alice fights the Queen in order to save the rabbit, and after defeating her, she's transported to another realm. I won't recount all of the different levels and their symbolism here, but I highly encourage you to read through the design Bible. Every level looks incredibly well thought out, both narratively and in a gameplay sense. The game would also include intermission type scenes, much like those in Madness Returns, where we would get a snippet of reality in London. These interludes in Alice Asylum, however, would be centered on Alice's shadow self, a being that hunts her across Wonderland and represents her desire to seek revenge on those who have done her wrong. In each of these encounters, Alice interacts with her shadow in symbolic ways, revealing her fears and vulnerabilities. These moments would have provided further insights into Alice's state of mind and her ongoing internal struggle, this vicious battle between choosing vengeance or finding a different way to move on with her life, to break the cycle. Vengeance on who, though? The game's main antagonist this time around would be Wilton Radcliffe, Alice's family lawyer, who we saw briefly in Madness Returns. In Asylum, it was to be revealed that he had helped Bumby sell the children from the orphanage, and the logs of each sale would be kept in this little black notebook that he has. His motivations, unlike Bumby, were purely financially driven. He serves as the final boss of the game, where Alice, having conquered her own demons, saving her own Wonderland once and for all, confronts Radcliffe in an attempt to stop him from ever doing this to another child. During the confrontation, Alice crosses over into his own mind, an Otherland. Faced with the now monstrous form that was once Radcliffe, the distorted representation of all of his material desires, Alice no longer fights just for herself, and she's stronger for it. Upon defeating Radcliffe, players are brought back to reality, where police inform Alice that her information about the Little Black Book checked out, that they successfully found several of the children that had previously been sold. With this knowledge, they haul Radcliffe off, a husk of his former self, to serve time in the very asylum that once held Alice. Here we see one final scene play out. Alice, leaving Radcliffe's office, hears someone humming a tune she was all too familiar with, the same one she would hum all those years ago in Wonderland. When she reaches the source of the sound, she's met with Angela, Radcliffe's most recent victim, and two policemen are standing by discussing what should be done with her since she's got no place to go now. Kneeling down to meet on her level, not to be just another adult talking down to a scared and confused girl, Alice speaks with Angela. She's holding the doll of a white rabbit, squeezing it tightly as if it's the only thing that could make her feel safe in this moment. "Where would you like to go, Angela?" asks Alice. "Maybe you should ask him. He might know where to go." She prompts again, gesturing to the doll in her hands. After a moment of consideration, Angela whispers to the doll before giving her answer. I started this video with a phrase synonymous with Alice in Wonderland, "Follow the White Rabbit." And in the most beautiful and fitting end to this series I could have ever wanted, Angela meets Alice's gaze once again. "He thinks we should follow you now." American McGee's Alice is a series that defied convention, offering a unique blend of psychological depth, artistic creativity, and bold narrative ambition. From the moment it debuted, the series stood apart from its contemporaries for its unflinching portrayal of trauma, mental illness, and personal struggle set against the hauntingly beautiful backdrop of a twisted wonderland. The first two games, American McGee's Alice and Madness Returns, challenged the limits of what a AAA game could explore, proving that video games could be a medium for more complex, mature storytelling. Yet, despite the critical acclaim and loyal fanbase that these games built, Alice Asylum was never made. The reasons for this are emblematic of the changing nature of the video game industry, where the financial realities of game development often dictate what projects see the light of day. In an era where live service games, multiplayer modes, and monetization strategies have taken precedence, narrative-driven single-player games like Alice Asylum have become harder to justify to publishers focused on long-term profitability. The cancellation of Alice Asylum is a reflection of how creativity and risk-taking have been pushed to the margins in the modern AAA gaming space. Games that delve into emotionally complex and personal themes are increasingly seen as niche, and their commercial viability is often questioned by publishers. The shift towards safe, mass-market titles has left little room for the kind of thoughtful, introspective storytelling that defined the Alice series. The very qualities that made American McGee's Alice groundbreaking, its honesty, its thematic depth, and its willingness to confront difficult subjects, are also the reasons why a game like Alice Asylum will likely never be made.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.